Well, once again, we have yet another beautiful Lord's Day that we can assemble together and to sing praises to His name and to study from His Word. And we are continuing our study in as we look at several prophecies, not all obviously, but several prophecies of the last days kingdom, the coming of the kingdom, as Jacob told his sons there in Genesis 49 that in the last days that the gathering would be unto Messiah. The scepter would not depart from Judah until Messiah would come, until Shiloh would come, and to him would the gathering of the people be. And we've been looking at some prophecies, Isaiah 2, for instance, 2 through 4. We've looked at the little apocalypse, Isaiah 24 through 29, Daniel 2, Daniel 7, and we've been in the last study we've been looking at the Olivet Discourse, which is Matthew 24 through 25, Mark 13, and Luke 21, beginning there at verse 5. And we've shown how that prior to the beginning of those texts, all the context is the same. Each element is laid out there. Matthew leaves out one that the other two put in, but it's obvious that the contexts are parallel. And so this is the same conversation that is recorded by Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And then, of course, we have John's record of the Olivet Discourse, the expanded version, so to speak, the Revelation. But anyway, we're studying these things, and we're looking at, we looked at verse 14 of Matthew 24 in the last study, where he said, "This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come." And again, the end there is the telos. And he is talking about the end of the age, back in verse 3. Up here, in verse 3, the end, syntelia, of the Aeon, age, not cosmos, but the end of the age. And so he also uses the word telos in various places here, referring to the end. And so he says then, in verse 15, when? So again, there's a time word. He says, verse 14, the gospel is going to be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations. Now, one of the points missed many times in studying this is when people see the phrase world or all the world, we picture today the globe, okay? All right, that is not the context. The word there is oikumene, that is translated world, and it refers to the Roman Empire, the inhabited land at that particular time. Not that there weren't people in other countries, continents, so forth, but this is having reference specifically to, again, going back to the prophecies, Daniel 2 and Daniel 7, the days of the kings of this fourth kingdom. The Roman Empire is the kingdom. So when he says for a witness unto all nations, then he is referring to the Jewish nations. And again, that doesn't exclude Gentiles, because they would receive the gospel as well. But this is a specific reference to the gospel being preached. Why? As a witness. Well, that's what the Song of Moses said. That's what the law of Moses was. That was put in the side of the ark there. It was to be a witness against the children of Israel because they would become so wicked. So this gospel of the kingdom, this good news of the kingdom, is going to be preached into all the world, unto all nations. There's going to be a witness to all nations. So he says, when that takes place, then shall the end come. Well, what end? Well, the only end in the context is the end of the Jewish age. The age that is represented by that Jewish temple, because that's what he's talking about. The time's going to come, the day's going to come. Not one stone will be left upon another. It's going to be thrown down. That icon of Judaism was going to be demolished. That would be the sign, the signal of the end of the Jewish age. So then he says, then shall the end come. So verse 15, when you therefore see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, whoso reads, let him understand. Okay, now, this is another one of those instances where I don't have to speculate, I don't have to interpret, I don't have to give my opinion on what the abomination of desolation is referring to. there is a lot of speculation, and people will even, in fact, just this last week, people have made the argument that there is no record anywhere in history of any ancient writer, the early church writers, that mentioned and said that this abomination of desolation took place. Well, again, I don't rely on history to prove the Bible. True history, true science will harmonize with the Bible. But again, this is one thing I don't have to give my opinion or my interpretation on. All we have to do is put scripture upon scripture, line upon line, precept upon precept. And so we will look at this. So this is our text, Matthew 24. And again, notice the color-coded phrases there between the three records of the Olivet Discourse. They'll deliver you up, Matthew 24, Mark 13, when they lead you and deliver you up. Luke 21, they shall lay their hands on you, persecute you, delivering you up. So we can see that these things line up. Okay, now, verse 14, the gospel of the kingdom be preached in all the world, then shall the end come. Now, some of the things are just a little bit in a different order. We look at Mark 13, that is below. He says, you'll be hated of all men for my name's sake. Well, that's verse 9 in Matthew 24. But it's repeated in Luke 21, you'll be hated of all men for my name's sake. Okay, and then where we're at here, the text in verses 15 and 16 actually. When you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation. Now notice he names the prophet, spoken of by Daniel the prophet. Stand in the holy place. Whoso readeth, let him understand. And then notice again another time word. Then let them which be in Judea flee to the mountains. Okay, so this demonstrates this is not something that is an end of time scenario, because if the universe is going to come to an end, and that's what this is talking about, then what good would it do to flee to the mountains? When we have time to flee to the mountains to find a place to hide, why would you try to hide when everything's going poof in the blink of an eye? So anyway, that shows that he's not talking about some end of time scenario. But this is a time statement. When you see the abomination of desolation, then that's your sign. Then let them that be in Judea flee to the mountains. All right, Mark's record, same thing. It just is in one verse, the way the translators rendered it. When you see the abomination of desolation, again, he names Daniel the prophet. And notice that he says, let him that readeth understand. See, that's parallel with what John says in Revelation, and how that there were spiritually gifted men in the church. They had these spiritual gifts, and that one of the gifts was to understand these things, and they could read and decode these signs and symbols, which are taken from the Old Testament. But they could point these things out and explain these things to the various congregations wherever they were at. Anyway, again, see that it's exactly parallel. The abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel. Then let them that be in Judea flee to the mountains. Now here's why I say that I don't have to speculate on what this abomination of desolation is referring to, because when we compare Luke's record, again, Luke, the next verse, let them that be in Judea flee to the mountains. So again, it shows the text is exactly parallel. But Luke says, and in the words of Jesus, when you shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. So if we allow Scripture to interpret Scripture, then the abomination of desolation would be the Roman armies coming and surrounding Jerusalem. And the statement is there, when you see this, then those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let them that are in the midst of it depart out. Let not them that are in the countries enter thereinto. Don't go into Jerusalem. See, if you're out in the countryside and you see the armies come and surround Jerusalem, flee to the mountains. Don't go back. Don't go back into your house to try to get your coat and your clothes and whatever. Flee. They had that warning. And they did that. And Josephus records that not one Christian died in the siege and destruction of Jerusalem, because they all fled. They fled to the mountains of Pella. And so I've got another one here to look at just real quick, because we looked at verse 14, this gospel of the kingdom be preached in all the world for a witness to all nations. And we looked at this slide last week, and I brought my crayons out to color code these words here. And the point is that every word that Jesus used to say that the gospel will be preached in all the world, oikumene, that Paul used the same words to say that that mission had been accomplished. Romans 10:18, their sound has gone into all the earth, ge. Their words to the ends of the world, oikumene. In Mark's record, the gospel will be published among all nations, that is ethnos. Paul used the same term in Romans 16:16. It said the scriptures have been made known to all nations. In Colossians 1 there, he even uses the word cosmos. And that's where Jesus said that go into all the world, Great Commission, go into all the world, preach the gospel to every creature, but go into all the world, cosmos. And Paul said in Colossians 1:6 that the gospel is coming to you as it is in all the cosmos, all the world. So every word that that Jesus used to say and to command that the gospel would be carried into all the world, to all the earth, to all the nations, to every creature, katissus, Paul said that had been accomplished. And so again, when we go back to our slide then, when this gospel has gone to all the nations, then shall the end come. So, we're burdened with the question then, do we believe what Jesus said? Did the end come? Because he said that's when it would come. So, since it's impossible for God to lie, then we must accept the fact that the end came. Now, we just have to fine-tune our understanding of what the end is referring to. And it is the end of the Jewish age, not the end of material creation, because that cannot be found in the Bible. And so again, when we look at our text then in Matthew 24 and verse 15, we notice again that he names Daniel the prophet. Okay, when you therefore see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. So what we want to do, and I didn't have time to put all this in PowerPoint and in slides format. And so we just want to look at Daniel 12 for just a little while, a few minutes here, and just look at these passages. Because, again, Jesus named Daniel the prophet, and he specified that the abomination of desolation was one of those signs to look for, because he says immediately after the tribulation of those days, that's when the Son of Man would come in the clouds of heaven. Okay, so Daniel 12:1 then begins with, and at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince, which standeth for the children of thy people. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. Now, this is another one of those texts, these prophecies, that I don't have to give my opinion, I don't have to give my interpretation on what these things mean. All I have to do is look at how Jesus quoted from this text, from this prophecy, and when he posited the fulfillment of it. Now, I mean, we can speculate on things. We can say, well, I believe Michael was actually a reference to Jesus because it calls him the great prince, and Jesus was a prince. He was the prince of the kings of the earth and things like that. But again, I don't have to do that because I just look at the way Jesus quoted this. Because, as Daniel says, there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And so this is referring to, and we'll tie some more verses in to show that, when Jesus said there in Matthew 24 that we looked at, I think, in the last study, all these are the beginning of sorrows. And the word there refers to throes or birth pangs. This is the beginning of the birth pangs. And again, that's our verse where we're at. And then Jesus mentions this again in verse 21, which we've not gotten down to in our study. But Jesus quotes this right here from Daniel 12. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time. And Jesus adds, no, nor ever shall be. So Jesus takes this prophecy and he interprets it and applies it in a way that there would never be another like it. Now, I suggest that this is what we read about in Jeremiah 30, the time of Jacob's trouble, where he says, ask ye now and see whether a man doth travail with child. Notice the birth pain motif there. Wherefore do I see every man with his hands on his loins, as a woman in travail, and all faces are turned into paleness. Alas, now notice, for that day is great, so that none is like it. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it. All right, again in Joel 2. Joel 2 begins with, blow the trumpet in Zion and sound an alarm in my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land, globe, let them tremble. For the day of the Lord cometh, for it is nigh at hand, a day of darkness and of gloominess, a day of clouds and of thick darkness, as the morning spread upon the mountains, a great people and a strong. There hath not, now notice, there hath not been ever the like, neither shall there be any more after it, even to the years of many generations. And notice that he says here, the day of the Lord cometh, it is at hand. Well, Joel posits this at this time referred to as the last days, as you read right on down in the chapter, that it should come to pass afterward, which Peter quotes on the day of Pentecost, saying, this is that was spoken by the prophet Joel, it should come to pass in the last days. So what Joel said was at hand. He was projecting into the future, into his future, that Peter quotes and applies as present right then in the last days. And so the takeaway then from this is this time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation. See, you can't have a time and an event. I started that statement out wrong. Let me back up and do that again. You can't have more than one time and event that has no other parallel. And that is one of the things that I detailed in my last lecture at the Indianapolis lectureship. Now, if I don't forget, I'll put a link to that in the description. But this event, this time, okay, would be unparalleled. And we find this unparalleled time spoken of in various places, such as the ones I mentioned there in Jeremiah 30 and Joel 2. And so I want us to notice then, again, that Jesus quotes this prophecy, verbatim actually. Then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time. And notice that this would be after the gospel had been carried into all the world for a witness to all nations. Okay? So it can't be the cross. It can't be Pentecost. After, well after Pentecost. Okay? Now, notice what he says here. There shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time, and at that time. At what time? At this time of trouble. That applies to the first century. And at that time, thy people. Who's Daniel's people? Those are the Hebrews. These promises, Paul said, these promises belong to the fathers. He says there in Romans 9. Okay? And at that time of trouble, thy people shall be delivered, notice, every one that shall be found written in the book. So here we have the opening of the book's judgment that is parallel with the opening of the book's judgment that we just studied from Daniel 7. And you can take the time again to read that text there. So what Daniel 7 says, that the Son of Man would come in the clouds of heaven for the opening of the book's judgment. Then when we look at chapter 12, we find the opening of the book's judgment and the next verse, the resurrection. In verse 2, the resurrection of the just and the unjust. And so, again, there was only going to be one last day's judgment, day of the Lord judgment, Isaiah 2, in Israel's last days. And so when we find in Daniel 7 the opening of the book's judgment, and we find the opening of the book's judgment in Daniel 12, then they have to be the same thing. And since the resurrection is tied to the same time, then it applies to the coming of the Son of Man in the prophecy of Daniel 7. That's just basic logic. And so again, then, this coming of the Son of Man, this opening of the book's judgment, Paul said in Acts 17:31 that God has appointed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness by that man whom he hath ordained, and he hath given assurance unto all men in that he hath raised him from the dead. Now, again, this is King James. King James cloaks the word mellow. The literal translation is, he has appointed a day in which he is about to judge the living and the dead, or to judge the world in righteousness. Living, that's another passage. Okay, then in Acts 24, verse 25, we find that Paul says to Felix that as a reason of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come, again, the King James leaves out the definite article, the judgment, and it cloaks the definition of the word mellow, rendered to come. So what Paul actually said was, he reasoned with Felix of righteousness, temperance, and the judgment about to be. Now that makes sense as to why Felix trembled, because Paul was saying it's about to take place. And so again, this opening of the book's judgment is mentioned in Revelation 20. It's called the Great White Throne Judgment, which is following the end of the millennium there, 1,000 years. It's mentioned in the first part of the chapter. So again, and Matthew 25, which I forgot to put that note on here, but Matthew 25, verses 31 through the end of the chapter, again, you have the judgment scene there of the sheep and the goats divided, separated, the sheep on the right hand, the goats on the left hand. That's when the Son of Man would come with the holy angels, that's Daniel 7, to sit on his throne for the judgment. And so that's why I say that everywhere we find this opening of the book's judgment in the last days of Israel, then it all has to be talking about the same thing. We can't just chop these passages up and try to say, well, now this was just some kind of a little semi-judgment over here. It's just, that's using man's opinions to make these texts not mean what they say. And again, that's why I say I don't have to offer an opinion, because Jesus quoted this text and he said that it would be fulfilled in and by the fall of Jerusalem. Okay, then he says, and many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. So again, this is the only prophecy of a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. Now, there are other prophecies of resurrection, but this is the only one of a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. And so when Jesus refers to the resurrection, all that are in the graves will come forth. They'll hear his voice and come forth. They that have done good, the resurrection of life. They that have done evil, to the resurrection of damnation. Then he is citing, he is echoing Daniel 12. Again, because Daniel 12:2 is the only prophecy of a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. And we'll get to many here in just a minute. Some will say that because it says many here, they'll go to Matthew 28, I believe it is, where it says when Jesus died, was crucified, and so forth, it says many of the saints arose and went into the city and was seen to many people there. And I said, well, there it is. Well, I'm sorry, no, but it's not. Because Paul is still quoting Daniel 12:2 in Acts 24 and verse 15, where he says, and have hope toward God, which they, and it's Jews, the Pharisees, which they themselves also allow, there shall be, and again, that's mellow in the present tense, there is about to be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust. So Paul here in his ministry is quoting Daniel 12:2, and he's saying it's about to be, it's about to take place. And so again, many. Some people will say, well, it says many here, that doesn't include all, and therefore that cannot be this idea of the general resurrection at the end of time, when every dead person that ever lived on the planet will arise. That'll be all. Well, if we use that logic here, then why could we not use it here in Matthew 26 and verse 28, where Jesus said, "For this is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for many for the remission of sins"? Well, did Jesus shed his blood for all, or just some, or even many? All right, let me make an illustration here. In Romans 5:15, Paul says, "But not as the offense, so also is the free gift. For through the offense of one many be dead. Much more the grace of God and the gift by grace is by one man, Jesus Christ, has abounded to glory." So God's grace has abounded to many. I don't know where I got the word glory. I misread that. Has abounded unto many. Okay, so hold on to that and look at Titus 2 and verse 11. "For the grace of God that bringeth salvation hath appeared to all men." Well, now, is this a contradiction? Did Paul contradict himself? Did God's grace only appear to some or many? Does many not mean all? See, this is just a figure of speech known as a synecdoche, whereas a part is put for the whole. Okay, that's simple to understand. We use that type of thing in everyday speech. And the only time that we have problem understanding that is when a particular idea or thought contradicts what we already have a presupposition about. And again, this is the only prophecy of a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. And Jesus quotes that. And he applies the fulfillment to the time of the destruction of Jerusalem. All right, verse 3. "And they that be wise shall shine as the brightness of the firmament, and they that turn many to righteousness as the stars forever and ever." All right, this is the sentiment that Jesus states in Matthew 13 when he is explaining the parable of the sower there that went out and sowed his seed, and there was tares that came up among the seed. And so the disciples came to him later and said, "Explain this to us. What did you mean by this parable? We don't understand this." And he said, "The field is the world, cosmos. The good seed are the children of the kingdom, but the tares are the children of the wicked one. The enemy that sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the world." That's Heon there. And this is the exact phrase that is used in Matthew 24:3, the Suntilia of the Heon, the world. "Reapers of the angels. As therefore the tares are gathered and burned in the fire, so shall it be at the end of this world," this age. And he uses the demonstrative pronoun there to specify this age. And so he says, "The Son of Man shall send forth his angels. They shall gather out of his kingdom all things that offend, and them which do iniquity." And again, that's the Olivet Discourse. That's Daniel 7. And then he says, "Shall cast them into a furnace of fire. There shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth." Now notice, "Then shall the righteous shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father." Okay, that's the same sentiment that we see here, that the wise, after this judgment and after this resurrection, the just and the unjust, which would be at the end, as we'll see as we go on, that the wise shall shine as the brightness of the firmament. And see, this just exemplifies what was predicted, foretold in Isaiah 9, that of the increase of his government and peace there shall be no end upon the throne of David and upon his kingdom, to order it and to establish it with judgment and with justice henceforth, even forever. And Paul would say in Ephesians 3 and verse 21, "Unto him be glory in the church by Christ Jesus throughout all ages, world without end." All right, age without end there. Verse 4, now notice here, "But thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, even to the time of the end." All right, now, again, notice that he did not say seal it up until the end of time. He said seal it up even to the time of the end. There's a big difference in those two phrases. Even to the time of the end. And so again, when Jesus is quoting from this prophecy here in the Olivet Discourse, and he's talking about the end, the telos, then this is what he's talking about. This is the end that he's talking about. And the end of the Jewish age is what Daniel was foretelling, even though Daniel didn't understand what he was foretelling. And Peter would state, and I forgot the passage, but Peter would even state that the prophets knew that what they were saying was not for their time. I'll have to look that up. But he says anyway here, seal the book even to the time of the end. And he repeats that in verse 9 of this text here. Go thy way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. Now notice what happens in Revelation. And he said unto me, seal not the sayings of the prophecy of this book. Why? For the time is at hand. You see, Daniel was told that it would be many days. Seal it up until the time of the end. And John, quoting heavily from the prophecies of Daniel in Revelation, and he is told, seal not the sayings, the prophecy of this book, because the time is at hand. All right, again, the end. That's what we've just looked at in Matthew 13 there, and explaining the parable of the wheat and the tares. And we can see it again in the same chapter there, where Jesus told another parable of the kingdom of heaven like to a net that was cast into the sea, it gathered of every kind, which when it was full they drew to shore and sat down and gathered the good into vessels, but cast the bad away. So shall it be in the end of the world. Again, the exact same phrase that is used in Matthew 24:3 in the Greek, hosentelia ho hion, the end of the world, the age. The angels shall come forth and sever the wicked from among the just. Again, that's the judgment scene in Matthew 25. Shall cast him into a furnace of fire. There shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth. But now notice what he says. Jesus saith unto them, have you understood all these things? They said unto him, yes, Lord. So when the disciples came to Jesus there and asked him about this, they were not confused because they understood it. They just wanted to know when it was going to happen and what the sign was going to be. They weren't confused. So again, the end, we have the telos in verse 6, you have the telos in verse 14, you have the telos in 1 Corinthians 10 verse 11 that Paul said that the things that happened to Israel in the wilderness, those were examples. They're written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the telos, the ends of the age, eon, are come. Present tense, not will come, not did come, are come. Actually, I think that's in the aorist tense there. But anyway, that's another thing I have to look up. I tend to forget some of those things, but even the King James gets it right there, are. So again, it's the same, the end, that Paul speaks of in 1 Corinthians 15 in his resurrection discourse there. And it is at the parousia of Christ, the coming of Christ, which that's the coming that Jesus has under discussion in the Olivet Discourse. Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven. And that would be his parousia. Okay, and that's what we have here in 1 Corinthians 15. Every man in his own order, Christ's first fruits, afterward they that are Christ at his coming, parousia. Then cometh the end, the telos, when he shall have delivered up the kingdom to God, even the Father, when he shall have put down all rule and all authority and power. And again, that's Daniel 7, of the Son of Man coming to the Ancient of Days to deliver the kingdom in its completeness. Again, in Romans 13, that Paul said there, and knowing the time, that now it is high time to awake out of sleep, for now is our salvation nearer than when we believed. Well, how could the salvation be nearer if it was full and complete and consummated on Pentecost? And see, this again, this shows us the proleptic nature of these things. They had salvation in prolepsis. They had it subjectively. They were awaiting the consummation that would be Jesus returning at the end of the age, bringing salvation. Hebrews 9:28, Hebrews 10:37. That's what they were waiting for, the consummation of that. And they were given the Spirit as the earnest, as the guarantee that that was going to be fulfilled. They were sealed until the day of redemption. And again, Peter said, the end, the telos, the end of all things is at hand. So again, it's one great end, the end of the Jewish age, the Mosaic time frame that these prophecies and these New Testament writers have in mind. Okay, then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, there stood other two, the one on this side of the bank of the river, and the other on that side of the bank of the river. And one said to the man clothed in the linen, which was upon the waters of the river, how long shall it be to the end of these wonders? And I heard the man clothed in the linen, which was upon the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand unto heaven, and sware by him that liveth forever, that it shall be for a time, times, and a half. So there again, there's the 3.5 year period, same thing we've seen in Daniel 7, and it's also in Revelation. You have stated 3.5 years, 42 months, 1,260 days. It's stated in different ways, but here in Daniel it is stated the time, times, and a half. And he says, when he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, all, not some, not most, but all these things shall be finished. Well, all the things he's just discussed. So again, I mean, as Jesus is going down through the Olivet Discourse, he is mirroring Daniel 12 and the way this is laid out. And that's what Jesus says when he gets down to verse 34. All these things shall, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. And so when we look at this here, that the man held up his hand, we find the same thing in Revelation 10, verses 5 and 7. The angel that I saw stand upon the sea and upon the earth lifted up his hand to heaven, sware by him that liveth forever and ever, created heaven and the things that are therein, and the earth and the things that are therein, and the sea and the things that are therein, that there should be time no longer. And this is referring to delay. There will be no more delay. We'll look at this verse in the New King James, for instance, that there should be delay no longer. In other words, it's at hand. It's not going to be held back. It's not going to be delayed any longer. And he says, but in the days of the voice of the seventh angel, and remember, you go back to chapter 8 and read up to this point, 7 angels were given 7 trumpets. They begin to sound one right after the other. One angel sounds, things happen. The second angel sounds, he blows his trumpet, things happen. And so this is actually in the days of the time of the 6th trumpet, because the 7th trumpet has not sounded yet. So again, this can't be the end of time. But in the days of the voice of the 7th angel, when he shall begin to sound, the mystery of God should be finished, as he hath declared to his servants, the prophets. Again, there will be time no longer, no delay no longer. And that refers back to the text we're looking at. Now notice what John is told here just a few verses later. And he said unto me, thou must prophesy again before many peoples and nations and tongues and kings. So again, proof beyond any question, this is not end of time scenery or predictions, because John could not go and preach to other people, nations, tongues, and kings after the end of time. And then when you go to chapter 11, I'm not going to take time to read all this, but do that in your own time. But we come down to verse 15, the 7th angel sounded. So now there's the last trump. There were great voices in heaven saying, the kingdoms of this world are become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever. Well, that's Daniel 2:44. And that's Daniel 7:13 and 14, and 18, and 27. And again, read these things. Take time to read these things thoroughly. Read from top to bottom, the whole chapter. Read all these texts and just sit and meditate on these things and ponder on them. Okay, and he goes on and says then, the nations were angry, and thy wrath is come, and the time of the dead, that they should be judged. So that'd be the resurrection and the judgment, wouldn't it? The time of the dead, that they should be judged. And that thou shouldest give reward unto thy servants, the prophets, and to the saints, and them that fear thy name, small and great, and shouldest destroy them that destroy the earth. Well, look right there, that thou shouldest give reward unto thy servants, the prophets. Well, that's what Jesus said in Matthew 16, verses 27 and 28, where he is citing Daniel 7. I mean, that's what I say. When we look at these things in context, they fit together better than a Big Ben jigsaw puzzle. And they fit perfectly. And remember that Luke 9, 26 and 27 is parallel with Matthew 16. And this says, "For whosoever shall be ashamed of me and of my words, of him shall the Son of Man be ashamed when he shall come in his own glory." See that? And with the holy angels. Well, again, that is Matthew 25. "When the Son of Man shall come in his glory, and all the holy angels with him, then shall he sit upon the throne of his glory." That is Daniel 7. And again, these things fit together perfectly. "Thou shouldst give reward unto thy servants, the prophets." And this is also cited from Isaiah 40. "Behold, the Lord God will come with a strong hand, and his arm shall rule for him. Behold, his reward is with him, and his work before him." Now again, I'm giving you a lot of homework. Read above this, and you'll see that Isaiah 40 is predicting the coming of John the Baptist. He was going to come and make the road, build the road, make the paths straight, fill in the valleys, and knock down the mountains, make a road for the Messiah. And this is the consummation, the completing of that, of when he would give reward. Same thing we see in Isaiah 62 and verse 11. "Behold, thy salvation cometh. Behold, his reward is with him, and his work before him." All right. Got to back up just a little bit here. All right, so we go on then to verse 8. Daniel says, "But I heard, I heard, but I understood not." So again, Daniel is predicting these things, and he doesn't understand what they mean, and he's told to seal them up until the time of the end. "Then said I, O my Lord, what shall be the end of these things?" And he said, "Go thy way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end." So again, we've looked at these verses already, Revelation 22:10, that he's told to seal not the sayings because the time is at hand. All right, "Many shall be purified and made white and tried, but the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand." Now right here is a point, a concept that we need to understand. And I want to use a couple other passages to illustrate this. In Isaiah 26, and again, I'm not going to read this whole passage. I'm just going to pick out a couple of verses here. And again, read this on your own time. Notice verse 5, and again, this is in the little apocalypse. "For he bringeth down them that dwell on high, the lofty city, he layeth it low even to the ground." And we've covered this verse in previous portions of this study, showing how Jesus applied that passage to the fall of Jerusalem, destruction of the temple, and so forth. All right, now notice, as you go on down to verse 10, "Let favor be shown to the wicked, yet will he not learn righteousness. In the land of uprightness will he deal unjustly, and will not behold the majesty of the Lord. Lord, when thy hand is lifted up, they will not see, but they shall see." Sounds like a contradiction, don't it? But it's not. "But they shall see, and be ashamed for their envy at the people. Yea, the fire of thine enemies shall devour them." Okay, now the concept I want us to see here is this. When these things would start taking place, the wicked would see things, physically with their eyes, they would see things taking place, like Jesus healing the sick, restoring a withered arm, healing the man that was born blind, even raising the dead. They would see that, but they would not see. They would not see the spiritual side of that. They would not perceive that this is actually the Son of God. And the same thing with the fall of Jerusalem. They would see these, all people would see the same thing, the same events, the same signs, if you will. The righteous would understand. They would perceive the Lord's hand being raised up in those events. The wicked would not. So that's the point I want us to get there from these texts. Jesus said in Matthew 13, therefore I speak to them in parables, because they seeing see not, and hearing they hear not, neither do they understand. And in them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah, which saith, by hearing you shall hear and shall not understand, and seeing you shall see and shall not perceive. So again, there's the same concept. We find that also in Isaiah 6, verses 9 and 10, stated the same way there. We find the same thing in Ezekiel 12 and verse 2. We see the same thing in John 12, verses 39 and 40, which is probably John's version of what we just read in Matthew. I'm guessing there. I didn't research that, but it says the same thing. Because it refers to Isaiah, their eyes were blinded, the heart was hardened. Okay, so again, there's the concept. The wicked, they would see these things and they wouldn't understand. And so that demonstrates the difference in ocularly seeing the Son of Man come on the physical clouds of heaven in a physical, visible body versus man not being able to perceive the spiritual nature. Because man is ruled by his senses. What he sees, what he smells, what he tastes, and things like that. And that's one of the reasons why with man it is so difficult to perceive spiritual things. And there, again, there's a verse that says that, and I'd have to take time to look that up. The natural man does not perceive the things of the Spirit, something to that effect. I have to look that up. And so, again, we can see this taking place in the writing of Paul when he said in 1 Thessalonians 5, and remember, he has just said in chapter 4, he's talking about the day of the Lord coming in the clouds for his parousia, the coming of the Lord, and the resurrection, those ascending up in the air to meet him. But of the times and seasons, brethren, you have no need that I write unto you, for yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so comes as a thief in the night. For when they, notice the contrast between you and they, for when they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them as travail. Remember, that's the motif there that we were looking at earlier, the birth pangs. Destruction comes on them as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. But you, brethren, are not in darkness, that day should overtake you as a thief. You see, those who are righteous would see these signs, and they were aware. The wicked would not perceive, and the destruction would come on them, and they would be destroyed. All right, again, we see the same concept in Revelation 22, 10, and 11. And we just quoted verse 10. Seal not the sayings of the prophets of this book, for the time is at hand. Now notice, he that is unjust, let him be unjust still. And he which is filthy, let him be filthy still. And he that is righteous, let him be righteous still. And he that is holy, let him be holy still. And that's another way of saying that there's no more time, no more delay, and there's no more time for repentance for these wicked people, this wicked nation. And so here is our verse. And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he that waiteth, and cometh to the 1,305 and 30 days. Okay, again, this is why I say I don't have to try to do these mathematical calculations and figure all this out, because Jesus quotes this text. He says it would be fulfilled in his generation. After the gospel had been preached into all the world, and by the time that every stone of the temple had been thrown down. That's the time frame. That's Jesus's interpretation and application of this prophecy. All right, now in verse 12, he says, Daniel is told, go thy way till the end. Again, what's the only end under discussion? Back up through here, and we've looked at that. Go thy way until the end, or thou shalt rest. Now notice that Daniel's going to die. He's going to be buried. Thou shalt rest. Now notice, and stand in thy lot at the end of the days. And see, what is so interesting about that phrase is when we look at the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of these Hebrew scriptures, the phrase that is used there is anestime, he, kleros. All right, anestime is the word to rise up, and is used in not everywhere, but it is used to refer to resurrection. Eis, the little Greek preposition, eis, means into, unto. It's a directional preposition, always pointing forward. And what he's being told here is, at the end of the days, you're going to stand, you're going to be resurrected into the inheritance. Kleros is inheritance. And you see, that's what Jesus said there at the close of the Olivet Discourse in Luke's record. Watch ye therefore and pray always, that you may be accounted worthy to escape all these things that shall come to pass, and to stand before the Son of Man. That's what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 10, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that everyone may receive the things done in his body according to that he has done, whether it be good or bad. That's the Son of Man giving reward, Matthew 16:27. And then one last passage I want us to look at briefly is that of Job 19, and this is a passage that some people will appeal to say, well, see here, because Job says in verse 26, and though after my skin worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh shall I see God. And people will read this and they will say, well, see there, that Job is saying that he is expecting to see, that he's going to be resurrected in flesh to see his Redeemer. Well, let's back up and look at verse 25, where he says, for I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth. Now think about that. I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth. Now, number one, do we believe that Jesus is going to return sometime in our future to stand physically upon the earth again? Well, I don't know of anybody in the churches of Christ anyway that believe that. I know some of the dispensational paradigms believe in a literal kingdom that's going to be set up in our future. But I don't know anybody in the churches of Christ that don't understand the fact that Jesus will never set foot on the earth again, that he would never set foot on the earth again. I mean, that was preached all the time, throughout all the decades in the church that I've been living. So that right there shows that he cannot be predicting an end of time scenario, unless you want to say that Jesus is going to come back and stand on the earth again. Now, in addition to that, it's interesting that even futurist scholars will say that there are translational problems with verse 26. And even when you will look at other translations, you'll find this rendered in my flesh, through my flesh, out of my flesh, and it's rendered in a host of ways. So we can't be guilty of taking a passage or a verse or a phrase and interpreting it in a way that contradicts other well-established principles and teachings in the scriptures. And again, just as I said, I don't know of anybody in the churches of Christ that believe that Jesus is going to come back sometime in the future and stand upon the earth again. So when we look at this passage in Job, what he is predicting is that Jesus, well, when did Jesus stand on the earth? What do we read in Hebrews 9 verse 26? He has appeared now once in the end of the age to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. When was that accomplished? When he was resurrected. He was raised up to sit on David's throne. That's what fits with this passage here. And when you look at, again, the proleptic nature and when these things will be fulfilled, and as we've studied here in Daniel 12, this resurrection of the just and the unjust. Well, Job would be in there, wouldn't he? Daniel would be in there, wouldn't he? That he shall stand in his lot at the end of the days. He would be resurrected into his inheritance at the end of the days. And Jesus quotes from this prophecy, from this text, and he applies the fulfillment to the time frame of the destruction of Jerusalem. Even in Luke's record, he says that these be the days of vengeance, that all things that are written shall be fulfilled. Luke 21 and verse 22. And so this is the thrust of what I wanted to look at this morning, was Daniel 12, and showing how that the time of trouble, the great tribulation, as Jesus interpreted it, and the opening of the book's judgment, the resurrection of the just and the unjust, and this abomination of desolation, that Jesus posits these things to be fulfilled in his generation after the gospel will be preached in all the world to witness to all nations. Then the end, the telos, would come. And therefore, unless God can lie, which he can't, the scriptures tell us that over and over and over again, it's impossible for God to lie. He cannot break his oath to David, and so forth. Then these things were fulfilled in the first century. And again, that's not my opinion. That's Jesus' interpretation, application, and his posit of these prophecies. They're recorded in Matthew 24. And so, with these thoughts then, and I pray that you will, again, read all these texts. We don't have time to cover all of them, obviously. We've probably gone too long already. But read above and read below. Make sure you get the context of each of these passages. And if you will look at these things with an unbiased mind, then you will see that they fit together perfectly. And so with these thoughts then, we will close our study for this morning.